Okay, now I'd like to give you kind of a high-level overview of Scanner's interface and start to get a sense both in the A and B panels for how these pieces fit together. Now I'm going to go through this fairly quickly, and that's by design because I don't want to get us bogged down in the detail work of the individual parameters. We'll get into that later. But first, I just want you to understand kind of at a higher level how these pieces fit together. So we've gone through most of the A panel, but just to refresh, there is this sample display in the center, or at the center top here, and this shows us the waveform that we're using, and it also shows us, using this faint green line, where exactly in the sample Scanner is taking the audio from. Right, so if I press a key, you see it kind of wiggling through that area. That's where it's taking the audio, and if I move to a different snapshot, you hear it scan through there until it gets kind of to its final destination. And that green line is showing you in real time how it's moving through the sample. Now, we have these three subsections, global LFO, preset morpher, and macro controls. The global LFO, I should mention up front, only really pertains to the A panel view. This is an LFO that can be routed to the position, the morpher position, and these macro controls over here. Right, so we're going to get into the B panel view, and there's a separate LFO there. So I just want to make this distinction up front so it's not confusing to you. The preset morpher, of course, we've covered. We move between these various presets in real time. And the macro controls are kind of these uber controls that control up to 3 of the B panel view parameters. Now, just to make a brief distinction, the source and variation controls pertain mostly to where in the sample Scanner is taking its audio, and source is kind of a more drastic alteration of that, and variation is a more fine-grained one. Filter and space pertain to the effects section, in particular to an 8-pole filter, and space to a reverb unit in the B panel. So that covers, at a high level, the A panel. Now, once I click into the B panel, we're going to be met with this warning dialog that tells us we need to turn off the preset morpher. So you'll probably have seen this if you've used this at all. When you click on the B panel, it gives you this dialog that says controls cannot be used while preset morphing is active. So you have to disable preset morphing to activate the B panel. You just hit OK, or you can also just turn it off in this A panel, right, by clicking on that. The B panel is divided in 4 main sections, and at the top is the synth engine. What we see here are these knobs that are the source of the modulation of the sample, right? So these essentially tell Scanner how to move through the sample. We have these 2 oscillators, an LFO, an envelope, and a feedback unit, right? So as I mentioned before, this LFO is different from the global LFO, but we'll get into this in more detail. Aside from that, we have our familiar sample display, and we also have a bunch of controls under here that we'll get into later that control where exactly in the sample we're taking the audio. We can actually move manually through the sample to a range that we want. Below the synth engine, we have this polyphonic processing unit, and this comprises a variety of different functions, including amplitude modulation, a delay unit, a low and high cut filter, and then kind of a general mixer that allows us to mix the level of the sample, amplitude modulation, delay, and filter, as well as an amp envelope at the end. Right, so this is what Scanner calls its polyphonic processing unit. And below that, we have an effects unit. And this effects unit has some more kind of familiar looking parameters. We have this 8-pole filter that I mentioned before. We have an echo or a delay unit here. We have a reverb unit. And then we also have this oscilloscope that shows us in real time the waveform, the output. Below this, we have a 2-part section. And this section is divided between modulators and macro controls. If I hit this switch down at the bottom, we'll move between these two. Right? So the modulators are fine-grained controls for each of these modulators up here. Right? We said that these oscillators, these 2 oscillators, the LFO and the envelope, and the feedback section are all modulating the sample playback. And so these give you detailed control or fine-grained control over each one of these modulators, right? So we have our oscillator A, B, the envelope, the LFO, a feedback, and then we have the LFO waveform, which is really part of the LFO section. And then if we switch over to macro controls, we see that here's where we get into the assignment of the macro control destination. So you'll remember that when we were up here on the A panel view, we had this source, variation, filter, and space. When we move into B, we have these same controls down here, but in this case what we have are the individual parameters to which we are assigning these controls. So for example, in position oscillator A, you see that that's one of the destinations that this source is controlling. So if I press a key and I move this, if you look up at that oscillator A, you see that it's moving that. But it's also moving a couple other parameters in here as well. We'll get into this later, but this is really the kind of high-level explanation of the interface. Essentially what you're doing is controlling at a very detailed level the controls that we have up here. So now that we've covered the high-level interface, we are going to go more deeply into each one of these sections and cover them in detail.